Hey fellas, so in 10.4 what we're going to do is we're going to solve back to the simple quadratic equations from section 1. We're going to solve those without graphing now. We're going to just use the square roots to solve them. So the one thing that you need to remember for this is when you take a square root of something, the answer could be both plus or minus whatever the answer is, because anything multiplied by itself is going to give you a positive number. Okay, so this first one. All right, we need to obviously solve for the variable, solve for x, get x by itself, and then we'll take the square root of both sides. So we need to get rid of that 3. So get rid of that 3. X squared equals 9, and then you can take the square root of both sides to cancel out your squared. And so x equals 3, but remember it's got to be plus or minus 3. All right, plus or minus 3. Now, if you end up canceling everything out, okay, so from the second problem, we're going to get p by itself, so we're going to need to subtract the 12 over. But when you subtract 12 over, they all cancel out, right? So p squared is just going to be equal to 0. And when you take the square root of p squared, you're going to get the square root of 0, which is just 0. There's no such thing as plus or minus 0. It's just 0. For number 3, right, you get even a little bit more messed up. Okay, we need to get the a by itself, so add the 3 to both sides. And we'll have a squared equals -1. However, if you stop and look at this, there's no chance that you're going to be able to solve this because you can't take the square root of a negative number. So when we try to take the square root of both sides, we're going to get a equals the square root of -1. Well, we don't know what the square root of -1 is because we know we can't take the square root of negative numbers. So the answer to that is just no solution. So anytime inside here, inside your square root, you have a negative number, you're going to have no solution. Lastly, number 4, it's pretty similar to the other ones. The only thing is you're going to have a fraction that you have to work with. Okay, so we need to get rid of that 25. We're going to divide both sides. So s squared equals 49 over 25. That doesn't divide evenly. It doesn't even reduce. So what we have to do is we have to take the square root of that whole fraction. So we're going to take the square root of both sides to get rid of the squared. And s is going to be equal to the square root of 49 over the square root of 25. So if you take the square root of the fraction, all you have to do is take the square root of the top and divide it by the square root of the bottom. Square root of 49 over the square root of 25. Well, both of those we know how to do. Square root of 49 is 7, and the square root of 25 is 5. So 7 over 5 is the final answer. We do have to remember, though, to put the plus minus in there. Because remember, anytime you take the square root of something, it's plus or minus. Let's do a couple more. So on the back here, we're going to do the same thing, right? But rather than giving the exact answers like we did on the front side, where we actually just left the square root in there, we're going to use our calculators and round to the nearest hundredth. Okay, so make sure you have your calculator out as you're working with me through this. All right, so for this first problem, we need to get this x by itself. All right, so we're going to start by adding 10 to both sides. So 2x squared equals 16, then divide by 2. And x squared equals 8. Okay, now to get this, we need to take the square root of both sides, and we'll have x equals plus or minus 8. Oh, root 8, I'm sorry. Plus or minus the square root of 8. Now remember, for this one, we're just going to get a rounded answer, so we can just type in square root of 8 into your calculator, and we're going to round to the nearest hundredth. So square root of 8 is plus or minus 2.83. That's the answer that I want for these problems. Now, number 2 here, right? You notice that this whole x plus 6 is squared. So we have to get all that by itself, then take the square root, and then we can worry about 6. Oh my gosh, bless me. So we need to get this x plus 6 squared by itself first, then we'll take the square root, and then we'll worry about the 6 at the end. Okay, so we'll start by dividing both sides by 4. So we have x plus 6, quantity squared, equals 32 divided by 4 is 8. And then we take the square root of both sides. Okay, so that cancels out, and we've got x plus 6 equals plus or minus the square root of 8. Okay, now we still haven't gotten x totally by itself, so we got to get rid of that plus 6. So now we can subtract 6 to both sides, and we have x equals -6 plus or minus square root of 8. So you see how we're going to get two answers there. negative 6 plus root 8, and negative 6 minus root 8. All right, so if I was asking for the exact answer, what I'd have written right here would be the exact answer. Okay, you wouldn't have to write it as two separate things. But because I want the rounded answer to the nearest hundredth, I'm going to actually type this in my calculator. So I'm going to type in negative 6 plus square root of 8, and that gives me negative 3.17. Remember to the rounding to the nearest hundredth, and then I'm also going to do negative 6 minus square root of 8, which is negative 8.83. And those are my two answers rounded to the nearest hundredth. Now the last problem here, all right, just kind of combines this whole thing together. All right, once again, you see my squared is acting on this whole x minus 2, so I need to get that by itself first, then take the square root, then I'll worry about the negative 2. All right, before I can do any of that, I got to get rid of the plus 7 and then multiply by 2. So I'll start there, subtract 7, and we have 2 times x minus 2 squared equals 18. Then I could divide by 2. So x minus 2 squared equals 9. Now I can take the square root of both sides. Okay, remember I'm taking the square root of both sides here because the parentheses are around the x minus 2. So that means the squared is acting on that whole thing. All right, so x minus 2 is going to be equal to plus or minus the square root of 9, which is plus or minus 3. Okay, now I can get two actual answers here. So x equals 2 plus or minus, I'm adding 2 to both sides, right, to get x by itself. So 2 plus or minus 3. All right, now for this one, you don't need to use a calculator or anything like that. I just have to do 2 plus 3 and 2 minus 3. 2 plus 3 is 5. 2 minus 3 is negative 1. And so those are my two answers. And that's all you got to do for section 4.